you ever wonder why it's often easier to speak up after someone else does? Or perhaps you've been in a class and at the end of a tremendously complicated lecture, somehow magically, no one seems to have any questions. As a chronic question asker myself, I've always found this group dynamic really interesting because for me, it's next to impossible to not ask questions. In fact, I think it may even be bad for my health when I hold them in. I begin to physically change color from red to purple. It's not a good look. But asking questions has really shaped my career as a former healthcare provider, researcher, and professor, and it continues to influence my work as a corporate leadership strategist. I ultimately help teams communicate better so that they can work together more effectively. I love what I do. But in the course of my work, I see bright, committed, talented team members struggle to speak up in meetings, whether that be asking questions or sharing new ideas. Part of that is how we're wired to interact within groups, but it's also due to how we've been trained to think about teamwork. My goal today isn't to make you more extroverted or tell you to just have more confidence to speak up at work. No, not at all. I want to show you how to stop silencing yourself and start speaking up at work so that our teams not only function better, but we can have greater impact in the work that we do. So if you're someone who says, "Ugh, I should have said that," but you didn't because you were worried what others might think, this is for you. If you're someone who thinks nothing of substance gets said in meetings and therefore they're full of fluff, this is for you. Let's start off with a relatable scenario together. Imagine you're in the conference room with 10 of your coworkers. Your team leader is presenting a new idea. Throughout the presentation, some questions pop in your mind. Maybe a few things you didn't understand, some things that didn't make sense. But you look around the room and you see your coworkers nodding, smiling. To your surprise, they seem to be liking this idea. When it comes time for questions, before asking yours, you wait to see if anyone else has them. Silence. No questions. If you're like many of us, you decide to save your question. You don't ask it. You think, well, maybe it's just me. Clearly everybody else is in agreement and I don't want to hold up the group, so I won't mention anything. Your team leader then says, no questions? Awesome. Looks like we're all on the same page. Let's get out there and get started, everyone. You grab your stuff, walk out of the conference room, and just before you make it back to your desk, that's when you start to hear the doubts. One of your coworkers quietly says to you, that made no sense. Then you hear, yeah, I think that's a terrible idea. And then even the classic, wait, so what are we supposed to do? Clearly, your coworkers weren't actually as on board as they appeared during the meeting. But if so many had doubts, why didn't anyone say anything? The reason that may come to mind is fear. And yes, data tells us that psychological safety and removing fear of punishment is key in getting us to speak up, voice opinions, and share ideas at work. But that's essentially where the conversation stops. We all know there are plenty of other reasons other than fear why we don't speak up at work. And simply removing fear doesn't guarantee that we will. What you all just experienced in that meeting was something else. It wasn't fear. It was pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance was first described all the way back in the 1930s, and it talks about how we don't speak up when we perceive our views to be different from the group's. It's our perception that this is the case, based entirely on our read of the room, which may not be correct. And this is a form of perception error. When I say perception error, I'm referring to our misperceptions of others' beliefs based on how we interpret their social cues. So when you looked around the room and saw your coworkers nodding, smiling, not having any questions, you experienced the power of perception error. You assumed they must agree. Maybe they see something valuable that you don't, when clearly they were just as confused as you were. But that illusion that your views were different from the group's made you decide to not speak up, to not ask questions. Your perception error changed your behavior. And perception has nothing to do with fear. In fact, think about the last time you were in an interview. They asked a question, you answered confidently, and then you see this blank stare on the interviewer's face. Happen to anybody? Yeah. Now your confidence is a bit rocked. You're thinking, did I say something wrong? Were they looking for a different answer? Is there mustard on my face? And then when the next question comes around, you hold back, all based on your perception that something you said wasn't well received, even though you have no confirmation that that's true. In my work, individual team members often share with me privately what they rarely say publicly in meetings or even to each other. They all get along. They generally like their leaders. They even usually like their jobs. Regardless, they aren't always speaking their mind. When I ask why, the answer that jumps out at me most is that they want to be a supportive and good team player. I think we all can identify with that internal struggle, but we can also objectively see how that could be a real problem. Teams are potentially making decisions that don't fully reflect how those individual team members actually feel. This often looks like interpreting silence or lack of questions as agreement or understanding. I'd love to know how many of us in here have been told to be a good team player. Pretty much all of us, right? It's an encouraged behavior. In fact, it can even impact whether we're promoted, whether we're viewed this way. But our typical approach to good teamwork can actually reinforce our perception errors. And I see this happen so often that I call it the outlier reduction effect. If we were to chart good team players on a graph, they'd exist somewhere around the middle here. They're polite, agreeable, easy to work with, described as low friction, go with the flow. What we don't recognize, though, is that when we invest so heavily in building teams of good team player group identities, we actually make it harder for people to speak up, ourselves included. Again, not out of fear, but simply because it feels like it's against the group norm to speak up, critique an idea, and risk looking difficult. And to those of us who are willing to speak up, we're considered the outliers. And one of two things happens. Either we speak less and less over time, eventually aligning with the group norm, or we leave the group altogether, saying, clearly this isn't the place for me. But groups tend to lose their outliers. We see a similar phenomenon in statistics. It's called regression to the mean, just as we see it in conformity studies across social science. And when we lose our outliers, others are even less likely to speak up because their perception errors are reinforced. And now problems aren't identified and better ideas aren't shared, even though on the surface, everything seems smooth and everyone gets along. Now, if we were looking just for efficiency, our current model of teamwork works beautifully. Few people object, the decision gets made. In fact, data tells us that in routine or highly standardized work, conflict and debate are not helpful. So if our job is to process payroll, which is considered to be a standardized task, not to do it in the most creative way, it's to do it in the most efficient way. There's no point in debating how to do it. Can you imagine if someone got creative with your direct deposit? Nuh-uh, not happening today, right? Anyway, some work is routine and highly standardized. It's still very important work, clearly, but it just serves a different function than other types of work. But as soon as we start having some complex, creative, or strategic requirements in our work, a moderate level of task conflict can actually be helpful, as long as that conflict stays focused on the project and doesn't stir up relationship conflict between people. But this is what concerns me. For some reason, we think that when everything feels smooth and everyone gets along, that means teams are functional. But this thinking completely ignores the different purposes of different teams. And in doing so, we make it difficult for outliers to thrive, even though we need them to spark exchange of ideas in complex work. Now, it's overly simplistic to say that conflict leads to better ideas. That's not what we're saying. It's actually when that conflict leads to something called reflexivity, and reflexivity leads to better ideas. Reflexivity is the actual process of debate and reflection that happens between people, but we need task conflict in order to spark reflexivity. And you can imagine that when we're worried about looking like a good team player or not, we speak up less, task conflict doesn't happen, reflexivity doesn't happen, and our perception errors are reinforced. So instead of focusing on smooth team dynamics and thinking that's what makes effective teams, we should practice what I call outlier thinking. Because we all need to activate our inner outliers to give ourselves permission to speak up, give a different opinion, and frankly, disrupt the polite agreeability that so frequently plagues our teams from operating meaningfully. Outlier thinking reframes the concept of teamwork, where the team's goal isn't unity, it's surfacing better ideas. I'll give you examples of how two of the world's most successful companies utilize this thinking. They each call it something different, but at their core, it's outlier thinking. There's no greater example of outlier thinking at the team level than Pixar, the animation studio behind Toy Story. Pixar's co-founder, Ed Catmull, said, "If there's more truth in the hallways than in meetings, you have a problem." To solve this problem, he relies on this feedback and debate system called the brain trust. The brain trust is essentially an open forum within Pixar where directors can bring their movies when they feel stuck in the creative process. And he mentions not only how absolutely critical this outlet is for generating better movies, but his role as the leader is primarily to monitor group dynamics and make sure people don't go silent. And what continues is constructive debate around these story ideas until what emerges is better. That is essentially protecting outlier thinking, where the goal isn't unity, it's surfacing better ideas. Now, for those of us who say, well, obviously this works in creative teams, but there's no applicability beyond that, right? Or maybe our teams are too complex, we're too big for this to logistically make sense for us. To that I say I'll show you differently. Amazon is not only one of the world's most successful employers, they're also one of the largest. With more than 1.5 million global employees, their structure still accommodates for principles that mirror outlier thinking. They have a list of leadership expectations for their employees, and number 13 caught my eye. It's called Have Backbone, Disagree, and Commit. Their employees, quote, do not compromise for the sake of social cohesion. They're actually required to challenge ideas when they disagree. The important caveat is, once a decision is ultimately reached, they also agree to back it fully to ensure its success. That's how Amazon defines a good team player. Not by how easy someone is to work with, but by their conviction to improving team ideas and committing fully to the execution. And the best part is you don't have to become braver, more extroverted, or outspoken to speak up. At Amazon, you're just doing your job. So why does all this matter? Somewhere along the way, being an outlier became incongruent with being seen as a good team player. And as a result, we speak up less, and our teams are potentially losing out on really valuable ideas. What if we reframed the concept of teamwork through the lens of outlier thinking, where the goal isn't unity, it's surfacing better ideas? We could openly debate ideas until what emerges is better, like at Pixar. We could brainstorm more ideas and make more informed decisions, like at Amazon. But just like anything, the outlier thinking philosophy requires buy-in at every level, within the teams themselves and within leadership. But it does start with you. Ask the question, critique the idea, be the outlier. Don't allow your perception error, that illusion, to diminish your capacity for impact. So now that you see beyond the illusion, what idea will you share?